you so much for coming today. This seminar is co-sponsored with CCPR and also the Sociology Department, thanks to the Irene Flecknoe-Ross Lecture Series, which is made possible by a gift from Ray Ross in memory of his wife. And we are so pleased to welcome David Kirk, who is professor in the Department of Criminology and Research Associate of the Population Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania. His research is organized around three themes: the causes and consequences of cynicism and distrust of the police and the law, solutions to criminal recidivism, and the causes and consequences of gun violence. And I personally have long admired David's work for its innovative and thoughtful methodological approaches to tackle really important social problems, including his work that utilizes Hurricane Katrina as a natural experiment to understand the role of residential place in influencing recidivism risk, his work with the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, which studies longitudinal cohorts to understand people's lives in social context, and really in a really rich social context, which includes neighborhoods, families, schools, peers, and the criminal justice system. And then his more contemporary work on gun violence, contributing knowledge on the correlates and consequences of that violence over the life course, over a really long period of time, the past quarter century. So finally, also, ASC recently made the exciting announcement that David will be formally part of the new editorial team of the Journal of Criminology, which is Criminology's flagship journal. So all of these reasons, I am very pleased to welcome David Kirk to CCPR. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Nice to. This is actually my first time at UCLA, but it's nice to have the opportunity to catch up with some folks and see some familiar faces, and to meet some new folks. On the criminology thing, I will say that I have no influence whatsoever with the publisher. So if you have something that's in the production process, it's out of my hands. But getting to what I want to talk about today, with a show of hands, who's hopped in a rideshare sometime in the last 30 days, whether with the driver or driverless? Okay, so a good number. So I'm not some kind of rideshare zealot. In fact, this work has been a bit of a side project for me for a while. About a decade ago, when Uber came out and was and had some PR about how it was the solution to drunk driving, I thought, well, this is actually an empirical question. Let's see what the data suggests, and I think there was a lot more hype than the evidence suggested. So I've been kind of critical of rideshare, but I will, and I think certainly the news about the levels of sexual assault and sexual harassment that the story popped up pretty routinely, including one, I think, yesterday. This is important to think about. But I will say that, we use rideshare from time to time in my family. I was telling some folks today, I've got 3 kids, and because of rideshare, I think I only spend about half of my weekends hauling my kids around. Rideshare kind of is a supplement. But as a matter of fact, my older kids, I have 16-year-old twins who just started driving, which has been quite an experience. Basically, overnight, our car insurance bill, and I kid you not, it probably increased tenfold. They're contributing to that, but you basically need a full-time job to pay for car insurance for teenagers nowadays. But so it turns out that one of my teenagers has got a bit of a lead foot. Had his first speeding ticket. So he's trying to get some extra shifts. If you've got people from Philadelphia in the room, you may have heard of Primo Hoagies. So he's trying to get extra shifts at Primo's in order to pay for the ticket and the car insurance increase. My other twin has got my recent parking ticket. And I said to him, and he was totally disinterested in this, when I was saying to him, he was like, or I said to him, back in the day, we had to like scrounge around like the floor mats of the car for like a quarter or a dime to feed the parking meter. Nowadays, it's just an app. There's no reason why you can't pay for the parking. Why did you get a parking ticket? Anyway, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent. That's all to say that, my kids are confronted with kind of the financial implications of what it means to drive. And so a week or two ago, their good friend Cole was over at the house, and they're talking about the fact that one of them had gotten a speeding ticket, one of them had got a parking ticket, and how horrible that was, and their buddy Cole said, well, that's why I have no interest in driving. And by the way, Cole is like several months older than them, but he doesn't have a driver's license. He has no interest in getting a driver's license. And he says, this is why I don't want to deal with any of that. I don't know if I'm getting my license. If I need to go anywhere, I'm just going to grab an Uber. And my one of my sons said to him, kind of just sarcastic. He was like, "Yeah, but if we did that, the cops will have no one else to pull over." And I was like, "Okay." But the thing is, they will have somebody else to pull over. There's always more people on the road engaging in violations, or kind of the massive amount of things that people may do wrong on the road or have wrong with their car that allows the police to pull them over. But because Cole decided not to drive, that just means that the police where we live can focus a little bit more of their attention on my family. So my kids are developing, with no prompting from me, a little bit of that legal cynicism that I have spent some of my career talking about. But that's all to say that what I want to talk with you about today are police stops and kind of the substitution effect of rideshare and personal driving, and then how some people are hopping out of their cars and into rideshare in this form of a transportation revolution. I went into this really exploratory, trying to think about, does that have any kind of influence on policing related outcomes? And I'll basically show you that in fact it does. So I'm just gonna give you a bit of a preview that we're gonna talk about today. So there are obscene disparities in police stops. I'm going to show you data from Chicago, but that's true in plenty of places. So that's kind of the puzzle, thinking about police stops. Why do they occur? What can we do about them? And I'm going to look at the role of ride sharing in this equation, whether ride share has penetrated our lives to such extent that it is changing who is on the road, and therefore who is subject to police enforcement. I'm going to show you some models that estimates the association between the growth in rideshare in Chicago and what happened to police stops and uses of force. Uses of force oftentimes occur in the course of a police stop. Especially when a police stop leads to something like a search. As things escalate, the situation gets more intense, violence can occur. So I'm going to show you some models looking at the association between ride sharing and those outcomes. And what we learned, just to get to the punchline, is that I do in fact see an association between ride sharing and stops and uses of force, to the extent that as ride share growth increases, we see a narrowing of black-white disparities in police stops and uses of force. And I can see the puzzled look on your faces about why on earth would that occur. And I'm going to get to that in just a few minutes. So I'm going to leave you hanging for a second. And so why does this matter? So I'm a sociologist by training, but I work in a criminology department. And so, this focus on police stops, obviously there's plenty of sociologists that focus on what police stops mean and how damaging they can be to society, including folks in this room who have spent a good amount of time thinking about this. But I wanted to really focus on thinking about transportation and mobility as a system that may ultimately be related and associated with policing outcomes. So kind of focus on transportation mobility and not just think about kind of policing and criminology. So that's kind of the preview. But I want to kind of start by with a little bit of a history lesson. So in the mid-1980s, the Illinois State Police came up with this program, Operation Valkyrie. Now, this is not the Valkyrie that you are probably familiar with, you know, with the assassination attempt of Hitler. This is, I don't know why the Illinois State Police called their operation here Valkyrie, but they did. But this was a mid-1980s program that was designed to reduce the amount of drug couriers, you know, bringing drugs into the state of Illinois. And so, you know, trained police officers or attempted to train police officers to recognize who are, you know, drug couriers, you know, driving, you know, along the interstates up from wherever, Missouri and whatnot, bringing drugs into Illinois. And by the way, this is a Illinois specific program, but there was something a similar program nationwide that the DEA was doing called Operation Pipeline. With basically the same effect. There was allegations that, you know, what these various, whether it's the Illinois State Police or other police departments, what they were doing was they were using these programs for racial profiling. You know, they were supposed to be trying to identify people driving drugs into the cities, and what they did was they, you know, they're acting upon, perceptions of, you know, who criminals are, and they were profiling. At least that was the allegation. And so there's this class action lawsuit, Chavez et al. Versus the Illinois State Police. This came about, I guess the ruling was in 1994. You know, it took several years to weave its way through the courts. But ultimately, the plaintiffs lost this case. And the court ruled, well, they couldn't prove that there was racial profiling, in part because there was no data at this time. I mean, this was mid-1990s, and they said, well, we just don't know if there's racial profiling. And in part, that's because the police were not, at that time, were not collecting data on the demographic characteristics of who they're pulling over. And by the way, you may, you know, be a little bit shocked, like how in like this time, it's the mid-1990s, how are they not, you know, writing down the basic characteristics of who they're pulling over? But I will tell you, I was living in the UK for a while, and London didn't start collecting this data until just a few years ago, and it was only after the Metropolitan Police in London pulled over a Black Olympic athlete and her and her partner, where they were prompted, the outrage and the advocacies they were prompted to start collecting demographic characteristics on people they were pulling over. So we've been actually slightly more progressive when it comes to data transparency in the United States than in the UK. Anyway, so no data on this. This is the mid-1990s. And so what the Illinois State Legislature started doing, first in the House and then in the Senate, they started making a push towards passing a law to force police departments to collect this type of data. And so there was a state senator that I'm sure you've heard of who was big into this fight. And so Obama had this to say. I devoted much of the early session on working with law enforcement to try to, once again, strike a balance between concerns of the community with respect to racial profiling and concerns of law enforcement in making sure that they can carry out their functions. So this is a very delicate situation, but ultimately this act passed. Police departments in Illinois were required to start collecting data on individual records of police stops, including the demographic characteristics of who they were stopping, and to make that data available. So I'm going to show you the first year of data. I'm going to show you just Chicago Police Department data. So here's the kind of what I'll call the baseline disparity in police stops by the Chicago Police Department. A 1.6 to 1 ratio. If you want to think about this compared to some kind of benchmark at the time, I think the white share of the population in Chicago was about 31%, and the black share was about 36%. So this is, an order of magnitude, different than that benchmark. So this is kind of a level of disparity, and so we have the data to then see if efforts were done, if they had any kind of success in reducing this disparity. Anybody want to take a guess at what direction it goes? Probably because I asked that question, you have a hint of what direction it goes. It blew up. By the 2023 data, it is now a 3.8 to 1 disparity in racial disparity in police stops in the city of Chicago. And as good demographers, you're probably thinking about, well, what happened to the population composition? Well, now I think the white population, the share of white population in Chicago has stayed roughly the same. It's may actually increased a little bit. It's about 32% in 2023 versus the black population has actually declined. So I think it's around 27% nowadays. So this increase is not explained by population shifts. So yeah.
The other kind of features the cops were looking for when they're stopping people, was it like types of cars or other things that might have served as controls? Or
yeah, I'll get to that. Yeah, that's that might be the slide. No, it's next slide after that, but I will certainly get to that. But yeah, so there's the debate is is this racial profiling or is it something else? So, but before I kind of go through the kind of the laundry list of things, let me just kind of set the stage a little bit more. And so I know we've got I'm a sociologist, and so I think about this not just in terms of these are police stops and it's just an isolated incident. These are situations that that have very powerful effects on individuals. In fact, I think it's appropriate to think of police stops as as a form of racialized control, as a form of surveillance. And even when you think about a routine police stop, I mean, what I'm laying out here on this slide are kind of the criminal justice consequences of this. Some of them lead to a ticket, an arrest, a use of force. When there's a criminal record involved, then there's some form of a punishment. And what we've learned with from 15 or 20 years of work on fines and fees, that the mountain of debt that people get when they are subject to the criminal justice system, oftentimes they cannot ever get out from underneath it. It is a source of inequality that that is very extreme. And I've done work on collateral consequences. Folks in the room have done this work as well. But when people are saddled with a criminal record, there's huge consequences for education, employment, health, family characteristics, housing, so on and so forth. But even thinking about going back, so I'm talking about kind of the criminal justice process. If the stop leads to more severe consequences. But even just thinking about routine stop, I'm going to embarrass Faith just for a second here and talk about the fact that even before the stop occurs, there's anticipation in the sense that people know it's coming. What do how do I prepare myself when I know this is this event is almost inevitable, so that when it does occur, it is not so damaging and debilitating. And so that means talking to kids about what you should do when you're first confronted by a police officer. It could mean turning on calling somebody on the phone or recording what's happening in order to to try to make, when this occurs, make it less damaging for individuals. So that's my way of saying for a couple of minutes that police stops are important sociologically for us to think about. I'm coming at this from not just kind of a mechanical data type of standpoint to show you some models of the association between ride sharing and police stops. I come at it from the angle of a sociologist trying to think about what are the various systems in society that can kind of reduce the level of racialized control that we have going on in society. So back to why this occurs. So the laundry list is, some people argue that there's differences in driving behavior across racial and ethnic groups, and that accounts for why these disparities. So it could be that some groups spend more time driving, they're on the road more, or that they're worse drivers. I don't think the data, it's hard to get data on how people drive. But the data that's out there suggests that this is not producing a 3.8 to 1 disparity in traffic stops. The other bullet points don't show up here. This is separate points, not all one point. Vehicle characteristics, differences in the types of vehicles that people drive on average across racial and ethnic groups. Some groups may have cars that are, more likely to have expired plates or a damaged taillight or something like that, and that might account for some reason why there's differences in police stops. Uneven spatial deployment of police resources. So if you ask the police, they're going to turn their attention to areas where there's crime. 50 years ago, police were more likely to do what were called randomized patrols, where they would just drive all over the place so that the would-be criminal would have no idea where they were. And so maybe the would-be criminal would always act okay. But the past several decades, police have been doing what's called hotspots policing. So they go to areas where they anticipate there's going to be crime, and if the crime rates differ by the racial distribution of neighborhoods, then it may be the case that the police are parked in racial and ethnic minority neighborhoods more often than white areas. So there's these bottom two are related to kind of what the police do to produce these disparities that I mentioned, but then there's also this bottom one relates to individual fights by police officers. And so, again, it's hard to investigate these because some of the data just doesn't exist. I'm going to show you in just a second kind of a methodological tool that some people have used. But first,
just to follow up, I was wondering if any of these factors changed over those 20 years, or is the evidence kind of suggests that racial profiling got that much worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. So. Again, I think with deployment of police resources, I think there is greater attention to for police to really target where they're spending their time, more so than 20 years ago. And again, on the kind of the top two, the differences in driver behavior and vehicle characteristics, I'd be hard pressed to think that accounts for a massive jump in disparities in Chicago. Yeah.
Do you have any data, any possibility to account for the race of the police officers?
Yeah, so it's a great question and a great suggestion. I have not incorporated that in this study, but one of the things that I'm using data from Chicago, and so a group of kind of community activists, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, sued the police department over data transparency. So actually there is really excellent data in Chicago from a group called the Invisible Institute, where you can get characteristics of the officers as well. So I haven't brought that into this study, but it is possible. And I'll talk a little bit about that data in just a second when I talk about the solutions that people have tried to reduce racial disparities in police stops. So on the question of individual bias, again, it's hard to collect information on driving behavior and on vehicle characteristics. And so one of my colleagues at Penn, Greg Ridgway, along with Jeff Grogger, developed what they call this veil of darkness test. The idea is that, in the daylight, race is more visible to the police than after the sun goes down. And so, the idea is they, should be more likely to act upon some individual bias during the day and at night. And so there's been lots of different criminologists have used this kind of method to try to tease apart just to what extent there is bias. And my reading of the literature, it's kind of mixed. Greg did a study in Oakland, and I don't think didn't find evidence of bias. And I think he did study in Cincinnati similarly. But I think probably the most prominent recent study by Pearson et al. This is using data from the Stanford Policing Project from over 50 different police departments, 100 million different police stops. Ultimately what they find is that Black drivers' odds of being stopped were 3 to 4% lower after dark, suggesting that there is some level of bias. I think that's an extremely important finding, but I would also remind you that that 3 to 4% does not explain that 3.8 to 1 disparity that I mentioned. This is a nationwide study, and then again the 3.8 to 1 is Chicago. So there's I think it's important to keep that in mind. So some evidence of individual bias by police officers. That's true, but there's something else that I would argue there's something else going on to produce the racial disparities in stops. So what's been tried to solve this, and again, I'm just kind of setting the foundation for what I'm going to talk about with Rideshare, but just kind of giving you a lay of the land. But a lot of advocacy, community advocacy, and trying to produce some solutions. But in terms of reforms, so one of the recent things that's happened in Philadelphia and also San Francisco is to reduce the power of by law, reduce the power of police to conduct discretionary kind of low-level stops. And so, these are things like they can no longer stop people for having, one tail light out. Can't stop people for, having something hanging from their rearview mirror. These are against the law. You may not even have known these are against the law, but it is. Police, have the authority to pull somebody over, oftentimes as a pretext for trying to do a broader search of a vehicle. They can pull you over for at least, in many cities, but no longer in Philadelphia and San Francisco, but pull you over for having like an air freshener hanging from your rearview mirror. So there's been some policy reform to kind of reduce the amount of discretion that police officers have. There's been attention, particularly after Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson and Eric Garner was murdered. There was a push to to have more training of police officers, both in bias awareness training and what's called procedural justice training. My reading of that literature is that it might have a little effect, but it'd be pretty ridiculous to think that you can, train somebody for just, 4 to 8 hours and assume that there would be any kind of effect that would last more than, very short term. So it's been tried. Some studies have found, some experimental studies have found some effect on reducing bias, but it's not going to last very long. And then accountability. These are another set of reforms. I had a Ph.D. student graduated a few years ago, Abdul Rad, who was doing a lot of really interesting work on police unions, and so I got into this literature while he was doing that, and looking at the fact of when there's some kind of reconsideration of collective bargaining agreements, can that do anything to increase transparency and accountability in policing and change kind of the disciplinary practices? There's not many examples of that. There's a little bit of progress in Austin, a little bit of progress in Seattle with renegotiating these union contracts, but that seems like a long time ago, and we've moved back away from those types of reforms. But there has been some attention to reforms to enhance accountability. And this bottom point, this goes back to that Chicago data that I mentioned. So there was a really fascinating study in 2021 in Science by Volker Baugh and colleagues, where using that Chicago data, they ultimately found that the Black and Latino officers in Chicago are significantly less likely to pull people over and less likely to use force compared to white officers working at the exact same time in the exact same police districts. And so that there's at least some evidence that, a push, and I think a lot of police departments are pretty eager to diversify, not just by race and ethnicity, but also gender, that doing so has lots of benefits. I think the problem is that the kind of the hyper-masculine environment of police departments and the racism of police departments means that it's not a good place for people to work. And so even if they're successful at recruiting more diverse workforce, retention of that diverse workforce is not good enough. But there are, police leaders, to their credit, they are attempting more diversity. And it is true that I'm going to talk about Chicago a lot today. It is a much more diverse police department than it once was. But yet we still have that 3.8 to 1 disparity. So even if you diversify, it's not going to totally solve the problem. But it is part of the solution, but not the only part. Mm-hmm.
Do you track how the diversity of the police department changes over your sample period?
That's similar to Victor's question. I don't, but I know it's a good suggestion. I will. I should add that into. I should go into that Invisible Institute data and my models. Suggested down. Okay, so most of what I just talked to you about, they're focused on changing enforcement. But what I want to spend the rest of my time today, I want to talk about what would happen to racial and ethnic disparities and stops if exposure to cops, to policing changed itself. Okay, to show you a little bit of the data about rideshare. So this comes from a 2022 survey that's conducted by the Federal Highway Administration. I emphasize 2022. They're redoing the survey this year, but this is the most recent data we have as of now. 2022, we're still feeling the after effects of COVID. So if anything, so 17% of people in the U.S. had used rideshare in the previous 30 days, a little bit higher in this room from my little poll I took, 22% among urban populations. But I think it's going to be some level lower than it is in 2026, in part because we are further out from COVID, and in part because just, there's people are, well, I think probably COVID's the main reason. And so I bring this up just because, in a very short period of time, I'm old, so I can remember a time before this existed, but in a pretty short period of time, we have had, a surge in transportation option. And so what I was really interested in exploring is what does this mean for police stops? But, for rideshare use to change people's exposure to the police, to traffic enforcement, really it would need to be some kind of substitute for personal vehicle use, and not just a substitute for public transit use. So there's been a few studies. It's probably hard to read from the back, but a couple studies, and this is kind of the transportation literature. That the evidence, I would characterize the evidence on kind of the substitution effects of rideshare is somewhat mixed. I think we need more studies of this, but at least with these two studies, what we see is that more rideshare trips does equate to somewhat less driving, and more rideshare use does lead to a decline in the likelihood of vehicle ownership. So people that were examined in this study, the frequent users relative to occasional users and non-users, the frequent users were less likely to own a car. So some evidence of substitution, though again, I think there needs to be more research on this. Mhm.
Kind of to your point before, how does ridership and the substitutions patterns vary by race?
There we go.
Oh.
So this is from the same survey data that I mentioned before, the National Household Travel Survey. And so in the prior 30, this is the total US population. I'm not showing you the urban population, but the gap between the bars is similar if I had shown you the urban population data. So pretty sizable race differences in rideshare use in the prior 30 days. And among those people that have been in a rideshare, use some kind of service in the prior 30 days, Black population are more frequent users, do it on more days. And so, why is that the case? It could be related to car ownership. It could be related to, there's in the transportation literature and the social science literature in general, there's this idea of transportation apartheid when it comes to talking about public transit, that there's, neighborhoods that are not served by, buses and subways and things like that. And so that might be another reason for these differences. One of the things that I can explore with the data that I have, but I'm curious about, and on ideas on how I might accomplish this. But I do wonder, given what I'm about to tell you for the next 15 or however many minutes, I do wonder to what extent rideshare use is a purposeful strategy to avoid contact with the police among some individuals, not just Black population, but any. I mean, one of the benefits of hopping in a Uber, Lyft, or whatever is they have those signs on the front of their car, magnified, and it's a way, it's a label that maybe the police are less inclined to pull somebody over when they see that it says Uber right there on the front windshield. But anyway, I think there's quite a few reasons why we may see these differences in the use of rideshare by racial and ethnic groups. But this is certainly part of the story, that if it is the case that some groups are more likely to use rideshare than others, then that changes the dynamic of who's actually exposed on the road to potentially being stopped by the police. Which I think is what I say right here. Yeah. So more rideshare, is related to less private driving, personal driving, and so then in theory that means that those people that have chosen rideshare over driving their own cars may be less subject to discretionary police stops, out on the road. Yeah.
Do you think this is different than in the past compared to cabs? Because cabs just maybe didn't go into certain neighborhoods or something? Because in the past, you could just also hop on a cab.
Yeah, so I think that's probably an accurate hypothesis. I haven't tested it myself, but one of the reasons for the growth in rideshare is just the fact that they're reaching places that, at least perceived to reach places that the taxis are not common. Which quite frankly, going back to my personal anecdote, is one reason why my kids hop in rideshare, is because we live in an inner ring suburb, and there's no taxis around. But that's, I think, but it's an empirical question. I think one that's worth exploring, but I haven't done it just yet.
The race of the rideshare driver, and if you factor into this, is there some targeting of different race of drivers, or stops among?
Yeah. So the data that I'm going to show you, with respect to privacy of riders and drivers, I don't have access to that data. But this is one of those things where if somebody had a connection with Uber and Lyft, and there's economists have some do. I personally don't. I think in part because I published some studies saying that they aren't doing massively great in reducing drunk driving. that maybe I'm not on their good side, but that's an unknown. But I think it needs to be it's an important research question, and and we'll figure out how to answer, whether it's surveying drivers or something like that.
Well, I was thinking about that too, but you said before that actually police is less likely to stop a Uber driver. So that made the point kind of moot, but I would, I guess, to some extent. Is that something that there's data to back up?
I'm speculating, but I actually think that might vary over time, in part because, I think these rideshare companies have gotten better at advertising or displaying that they're a rideshare car and not just just a normal vehicle. I mean, I guess what Lyft has always been pretty good about marketing their cars, but if I recall correctly, for a while, Uber was not, didn't have the magnified light on their dashboard. So, but I think the more that those rideshare companies, like taxis, can display that they're a commercial vehicle, at least I would hypothesize. I don't have any data to back this up, but I'd hypothesize that would influence police behavior to some extent. Make them less likely to be pulled over for discretionary stops, not for speeding, like real moving violations, but for the kind of the discretionary stuff. But I don't know exactly, but I'm just that's what I'd hypothesize. Please.
It seems like with all the things that you're talking about, that race actually operates like at a neighborhood level versus an individual level. I mean, thinking about policing, right? That hotspots are often neighborhoods which might be racially coded or something. Do they have different maps where they patrol or where they concentrate over time? Because I would assume they do. I'm even thinking about my sister who drives rideshare in Phoenix, and she talks about how obvious it is when she's out there driving that there are like basically no go zones for all of the drivers out driving that night and stuff. So I'm wondering if there are any good data that let you get at neighborhood distributions of race or of crime, or I mean, I know segregation is going down overall in Chicago, but it's also concentrating in certain areas of the city.
So I'm going to punt on that question a little bit because what I'm going to in the statistical models I'll show you in a minute, I'm going to add district fixed effects and month fixed effects. So I'm basically going to be comparing, what happens within a district, but in thinking about kind of the demographic characteristics of neighborhoods, the models I'm going to show you will in effect account for kind of the, stable characteristics. But if a neighborhood was changing rapidly, I need to my model.
Oh, no, I'm just kind of curious if the police have data on those sorts of things and if they're publicly available.
Yeah, I mean, it's given that it's American Community Survey type of data. I mean, to what extent they are sitting in their rooms talking about how much of that's part of their strategy. I think their conversations are, here's where crime is concentrated, we're going to go, and it just so happens that it's an area with these characteristics related to racial composition and poverty. But they are, policing is more data driven now than in the past, and they're deploying their resources based upon they're analyzing census data just like we are to some extent. All right, so a couple of hypotheses of rideshare. We go to 115, is that right? Okay. If rideshare substitutes for personal driving and reduces exposure to traffic enforcement, then it's greater use, as I showed you on the previous slide, relatively greater rideshare use among the Black population compared to white. Then I hypothesize that because of that, it should narrow the Black-white disparities in traffic stops. And by the way, I'm going to actually show you data for Black population, white population, and Latino population in Chicago. I'm emphasizing Black-white here and in some other slides, in part because that's where the huge disparities are. But anyway, so that's first hypothesis. Second one, I haven't talked a lot about use of force yet, but it is, it's a downstream outcome of police stops. And if rideshare narrows black-white differences in police stops, then I hypothesize then it will also narrow black-white differences in the likelihood of being subjected to use of force by the police. Data methods, a whole lot of rideshare in Chicago. And so I'm going to show you data from 2019 to 24, and I'll show you what the rideshare data looks like in just a second. But roughly about 80 million rideshare trips per year in Chicago, less in 2020. So, hundreds of millions of rideshare trips. I've got from that study that Obama was so helpful in getting the police to collect that data. So I'm going to use information on 2.6 million police stops by the Chicago Police Department. And I'm going to use information on what are called tactical response reports. These are basically use of force reports produced by the Chicago Police Department. I'm going to merge all that up by district, police district, and month across that time frame. So just aggregate this up. It's 420 million. I think I blew up one or two computers trying to get it to do it, and eventually figured out a way to do it more efficiently. And then ultimately, I'm gonna show you some negative binomial models today, but I've done similar analysis with some Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood models, and I'll show you a little bit more of the model specification in just a second. But I just want to show you the rideshare data. So Chicago has not quite returned to the pre-pandemic levels. So pre-pandemic, we're talking about 18 million or so rides per month, and then it dropped, and now we're back up to about 15 million. But I don't know what it's like in LA. LA probably is going to surpass that by quite a bit. Anyway, a whole lot of rideshare. What this shows is kind of relative to what the beginning of 2022 was like. It shows the growth. I mean, ultimately, I'm going to show you some models about the growth in rideshare and how that is associated with police stops and uses of force. So it's important to picture the growth over the last few years. So the bold line here is kind of the citywide average, and but what this shows is that everywhere there's growth since 2022, but the level of growth it's varying across these police districts. These kind of gray lines represent the 22 police districts in Chicago. So it's growing everywhere, but with a different magnitude. But we're talking about an order of about a 60% increase in just a few years in rideshare. A bit of an artifact in part because that's following on from COVID, but this that's part of the growth. It's just recovering from that period of time.
Mm-hmm. Data on prices?
On prices? Oh, that is a great question. I probably do. I'll have to check.
They've changed their pricing strategies very substantially.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things that I've been thinking about with this, not to go off on a tangent, but one of the things I've been thinking about is in Chicago and in some other places, they have like congestion pricing for rideshare, and I've tried to think about if I could use that as a natural experiment of sorts. And they've had kind of a couple different versions over time of congestion pricing, so I can use a couple different policy experiments. But I think I do have that information. I just haven't incorporated it. Yeah, it was a busy semester.
Can you tell us anything about these districts that have really high ride use share?
So the high ones would be, as you might imagine, the downtown loop area has a whole lot of ride share. O'Hare and Midway airports have a whole lot of ride share. Touristy areas are going to have a lot of activity. But even I mean, again, this is data relative to to 2022 levels, but so this doesn't necessarily show. So I don't have a map that shows kind of per capita rideshare trips. Maybe I'll think about that next time. But But I think it is true that, all throughout the city, there's a heavy amount of rideshare use, but, more so in the tourist areas.
So it sounds like the story you're trying to tell us is that Black individuals are opting out of individual travel into rideshare, which is decreasing their exposure to these discretionary stops. Could this increase just be explained more by increased travel, like tourists are flooding back to Chicago, and the increased rideshare just could be not Black residents?
Could be. And I'll get to kind of alternative explanations in a minute, but I think there's, I'm going to be very careful. I'll start it now and I'll say it again, probably a few more times, that I'm going to talk about associations today. And I think that until I can kind of confront those alternative explanations, and I'll mention one or two more, I shouldn't be, using the word causality. But there are some alternative explanations, sure. This didn't. I promise that's not my image. Anyway, this was meant to show you that I'm going to log the rideshare count, and that's the main independent variable to measure rideshare intensity is a log of it. I don't want to, when I talk about the effects, I'm going to translate the coefficients into, think about percent change in police stops and use of force from a proportional change in rideshare activity. What I'm going to show you today actually is almost a double count, because I factor in both the location of the pickup and the location of the drop off of the Uber, because they don't always just stay in the same police district as you might imagine. I haven't gotten around to doing a robustness test of whether I just counted one or the other, just either the pickup or the drop off, but I will do that. But so right now, I said I was using 420 million, or that there's 420 million records of rideshare in my data, but the analyses you're going to see are basically using 840 million.
Maybe this is on the to-do list, but can you look at miles traveled? So you kind of think about the risk of being stopped as, the exposure to risk is at each mile, there's an exposure.
Yeah. So I do have miles traveled, or I can compute miles traveled
in Chicago.
among the rideshare users, but in Chicago in general, not at the temporal and geographic unit that I would want. It's hard to, that data doesn't exist. I'd love to have miles traveled for every vehicle in Chicago, but I'd want it at a pretty fine grain, and I don't think it exists.
I mean, it just seems like there are short trips when the risk would be lower, or maybe lower. We don't know. Yeah.
And I should note that, when the stops that I'm going to look at here.
So what you're getting at, what you would need is, if you have drop off time and the pickup time, basically the exposure is proportional to the time you're outside.
What I was going to say is, I'm looking at not stops of the rideshare vehicle. I'm looking at stops, period. So even if I knew exactly what happened with the rideshare trips in terms of their distance and whatnot, I'm focusing on the broader set of police interactions.
Right, but you're kind of looking at the rides as the unit of exposure. Is that right?
I am looking at the 2.6 million stops that occurred by the Chicago Police Department. The rideshare as the independent variable is just the amount of rideshare trips in a police district in a given month is how I'm incorporating rideshare into the analysis.
And I guess what Patrick is asking, and I'm trying to ask, is can you use, instead of the independent variable being the ride, can it be the number of minutes exposed during the ride, or the number of miles exposed? You said miles isn't possible, but maybe minutes are.
Well, again, of the, yeah, I could do that. Yeah. Probably not minutes, but I probably could do miles. Yeah, I think I could. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent suggestion. Yeah, because I mean, part of the conversations I've had today is even a mile or 7 miles in LA can take an hour. So similarly, driving from Midway Airport, yeah, even a trip, a Midway Airport staying in the same police district could take a whole lot of time, or O'Hare. So point well taken. All right, so here's the main model. I'm looking at two different. I'm going to show you 2 different outcome variables: police stops and use of force in a given police district in a given month per race group. Racial and ethnic group have a month, year, and district fixed effects, and really I'm going to focus on the beta 4 and beta 5 coefficients. I'm not going to have time to show you today, but I did. I've had there's lots of robustness tests, as folks in the room have already recommended. I've already done a couple. One where I've added another fixed effects, district by year fixed effects, to kind of account for slow moving change, maybe gentrification, things like that. And then like I said, I tried a different modeling strategy with the PPML. I do have slides on that. Probably can't talk about it, but I have a chance to stay after. I can maybe show you that. I'm going to show you results on what I call the absolute effect, as well as the relative effect. The absolute effect is whether race-specific outcomes change as rideshare grows in a police district. And the relative effect is whether the rideshare and police stop association, whether it differs by racial and ethnic group. And this is again the racial and ethnic group of the people that are being pulled over. So first question, did police stops did police stops change overall as rideshare grew? Not really. So this is a non-significant increase, and so I asked this question in part because when there's more Ubers and Lyfts on the road, is that changing the level of police enforcement? And no, and I think that's in part because the police have a budget for traffic enforcement, and they're going to go out and they're going to make stops until they run out of that budget. And so even if there's more rideshare trips going on, I don't think it's going to change the total volume of the stops that they're making. So I mentioned this in part because of the slide I'm about to show you next, which looks at the racial distribution who's getting stopped. But that change in racial distribution that I'm going to show you, I don't think it's because the police have changed their total activity. It's just they changed who they're actually pulling over. And so when we look at the racial and ethnic distribution of stops, what we see is that white drivers, for every 10% increase in rideshare activity, there is a 4.5% increase in stops of white drivers and a 6% decrease in stops of black drivers. Those are significant effects. The Latino difference is non-significant. So the rise of ride sharing seems to be associated with a reallocation of traffic stops across groups within police districts. So that was the absolute effect. The relative effect. So the beta 4, beta 5 coefficients that I mentioned, both significant and negative. So what this suggests is that the association between the growth in rideshare and police stops is significantly more negative for black drivers and Latino drivers than for white drivers. So that's the police stop effect. And so, so the first result I showed you just about stops in general ride sharing does not appear to be associated with changes in overall traffic enforcement, but it does appear to be associated with changes in the racial distribution of who is getting pulled over by the cops. In this, and again, it may reflect the fact that Black residents are relatively more than white residents are substituting, getting out of their own cars and jumping into a rideshare vehicle, and that may be one explanation for what's going on. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to jump quickly ahead to the use of force results. Hopefully, the colors are showing here, but this is just a schematic of what's going on. But if rideshare changes who's behind the wheel, and therefore changes who is getting stopped by the police, it might also change who are subject to police use of force. So rideshare grows, changes the risk set of people that are on the road, the racial distribution of the risk set of people on the road, changes who's getting pulled over. And the hypothesis is that then it may also change the racial distribution of subjects of abuse of force. And so, yes, a 10% increase in rideshare activity is associated with a 4.1% increase of use of force against white subjects and a 4.7% decrease against Black individuals. And again, the Latino result is non-significant in this analysis. So again, like with what I showed you with the police stops, it does appear that as ride sharing increases in police districts, we're seeing a reallocation of who is subject to kind of a downstream effect of those police stops. In this case, who is subject to police violence. Please.
So these use of force reports, they don't include use of force that results in like emergency response. So you subset for things outside of car patrol, or so what's in your sample?
So these are the uses of force that occur outdoors from officers in vehicles. That's all of them. This excludes those uses of force that occur indoors anywhere and by officers arriving at the scene by some other way, on a bicycle or a horse or something like that. So these are outdoors, police from police in clubs.
Yeah, I have two questions. Is the 10% increase in rideshare activity, is that specific to certain neighborhoods? You mentioned before that it's a lot of this activity is in O'Hare Airport region. Like, do you have like a sense of the geographic distribution where this increases?
I would think of it as a 10% increase in rideshare use in a police district in a given month would equate to, on average, a 4.1% increase in uses of force against white individuals in that police district.
Okay. My second question is, so the story here is that certain individuals in Chicago are being kept out of their car and into an Uber instead. But is that correct?
So the people are hopping in an Uber instead of using their own vehicle. The idea is, the narrative is, it reduces their exposure to policing to some extent.
Yes. Are you at all considering that maybe people are actually turning to Uber, as in like they're becoming Uber drivers, and there's an increase in rideshare activity because there's more people that are actually trying to be drivers?
Yeah. There is. I mean, that is certainly true. There's over, relative to that 2022 period to the present. Yeah, there's more drivers, not just the same people driving more often.
Yeah, because I'm from Chicago, so I love this paper. But yeah, I feel like a lot of there is a really high correlation of like poverty and race. So you would think that like if there's a job opportunity and it's very easy to get to and you're low income, turning to Uber might be a very viable option for certain communities in Chicago.
Yeah, so I think it's not only a good source of employment, it's also I mean, part of the reason why I wanted to focus on mobility and transportation and not just, and bring it into a conversation with kind of criminology and policing is because transportation is such an important aspect of people's lives and it gives them access to, to employment and so much more, especially in communities that, don't really have any other transportation options. But in terms of your question, thinking about kind of the, I probably can get more, I think I do have more fine-grained information on, on level of not just ridership, but also drivers. I can think about maybe incorporating that into the analysis. I'll have to think about that. Thanks.
An interesting source of heterogeneity, I think, would be to think about stops, or maybe you have data on when the majority of stops happen. They mostly stop at night, or these when did the use of force happen? Because if we're talking about that, a lot of this airport travel, I'm guessing those rides in or out of rideshare are much less likely to have police stops. And so if you can kind of separate that, maybe that would also maybe help get our minds away from just we all just know about Ubers because we're going to the airport. We just all came back from PAA. That's the last Uber. That's the last Uber ride we took. If you can find that this association still exists when you restrict to maybe the most likely times for use of force or most likely times when people get pulled over, that might be we could learn a little bit more too about that.
Yeah. No, it's a great suggestion. Yeah, I mean, I should do a robustness where I remove O'Hare and I remove the loop, do something like that. But yeah, with roughly 80 million trips per year, there's certainly a lot of airport runs, but a whole lot of other things. People using rideshare for just daily activities. But yeah, there's a way I can play around with the data, and there's a way I can kind of I should do an analysis focusing on nighttime rides versus daytime rides, and see how robust the findings are.
Sorry, Dave, I have one more question for you. So obviously we don't think that maybe this is decrease in forces specific to Uber. If there was an expansion of other types of travel in Chicago, maybe we would hope that this hypothesis that you would have would hold up. There's I was just did a Google search, there are certain metro stops that reopen after construction, or you could look at fair holidays for metro.
Yep.
Maybe that can be an additional way. I mean, because it sounds like you have some really fine-grained data where you could look not just within these districts, but really at small, maybe census tracts, for example.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion, but you're exactly right. I mean, the more the story I'm talking about is ride sharing, but it's broader as transportation. If we expand the opportunities for people to get to where they go and they're on the road in their own personal vehicle less, then the hypothesis is that it should affect who's subject to getting pulled over and in particular and potentially violent. I think I've given you the punchline. Let me see when I wanted to wrap up. So just quickly, I talked about alternative explanations, so it could be the case that, so I weaved a story of, that rideshare is changing the risk set of drivers on the road, and that's why I'm finding what I found. It could be the case that there's, that, rideshare is a substitute for public transit, not necessarily personal driving use. And so when people are not hopping out of their cars, instead they're hopping off of, they're no longer taking buses or subways, then what that would do is increase the traffic congestion in Chicago and increase the vehicle miles traveled. And if that's the case, then the police are kind of swimming in a mountain of Ubers everywhere, which, I think we probably all experience in certain places. And they are spending their time kind of directing these Ubers so they're not running over people. And so instead of pulling people over, they're just trying to keep us safe because there's so many Ubers around picking people up. So that might explain, so I need to think through this. That might explain why I see a decline in the stops of Black drivers, but I don't think that explains why I saw an uptick in stops of white drivers. But that's all to say that I appreciate the comments on alternative explanations. I'm thinking through it myself, but on the surface, at least this one, I don't think that's the full story of what's going on here. But I'm careful to say that these are associations. Just doing Chicago. Chicago is unique. It's got some pretty fine-grained data. I wish we had this kind of information on rideshare nationwide. Design, I have month and district fixed effects, but there's a possibility for unobserved time varying factors that are correlated with both the independent variable and the outcome. So I need to do better about that. And then the reason I have this data is because Chicago requires rideshare companies to archive their data with the city once a month, but they do want to protect the privacy of their riders. So I don't have demographic characteristics in that data. So I know in this survey data that the Black population is more likely to take Uber than the white population, but I don't know that specifically for Chicago. I wish I did. So I need to think about if there's a way to get that. But overall, my pitch to you was, when we think about police stops, let's not just think about it from the angle of criminology. Let's think about it from the angle of mobility, because I think what we have experienced, whether it's just taking a rideshare from PAA to the conference hotel to the airport, it's impacted our lives, and part of my research agenda has just been to explore the impact. So anyway, I appreciate your time and your questions.